During the 1800s, a nationalist movement among the Jews in diaspora emerged in response to persecution. These Jews, known as Zionists, sought to re-establish Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. During World War I, the major imperial powers, including Britain, France, and Russia, were allied against Germany and Turkey and vied for control of the Middle East and its newly discovered oil fields. The Zionists skillfully played off the need for the support of the Jewish communities in each of these nations for the war effort, in order to get backing for their settlements in Palestine.
And so once they began to get backing from individuals, philanthropists, the Rothschilds of Paris particularly, they were able to begin something. You have one wave, the first Aliyah, and then you have a second in 1905 where David Ben-Gurion comes over. And these people were highly militant. And they criticized the first wave, because the first wave came over, and while they purchased land, absentee landowners, by the way, not Palestinians, who had bought up the land of the 19th century, they did not expel the Palestinians. They used them to work. And as labor. And when you had the militant Zionists, who were very close to communism, far right, far left wing, hardline people, came in, they said only Jewish labor can build a new Israel, and you cannot have Palestinian labor, you see. So they're very critical of this. And at the same time, they were quite open about their objectives. So the Palestinians were very aware of this, you say, and very aware of Zionist objectives, and Zionists were quite willing and aware to confront and take on Palestinian objection.
It was one of the most audacious acts of terror the world had ever seen. They used 350 kilos of gelignite and TNT, and they planted the bomb in broad daylight in a building full of people. Nearly 60 years on, and it is as fresh in the memory as ever for those involved.
I was running as fast as I could, with the bomb on my shoulder. There were a lot of explosives inside. It was heavy.
The bomb killed 91 people and 45 others were injured. But little did the bombers of Jerusalem's King David Hotel back in 1946 know that they were one day to be hailed as the founding fathers of a new age of terror. For their success inspired waves of imitators around the world.
If my sacrifice for that is to be called a terrorist, then I'm glad to have been a terrorist for liberation.
We didn't mind being called terrorists then, because we actually used force, such force, a brutal force, in order to get rid of them.
We knew we only had one chance in 1,000 of coming out alive. But death was around every corner.
This is the story of the birth of modern terrorism, of the activists who invented it, and of how it has been appropriated and dispersed around the globe.
We really don't know what would have happened. Zionism might not have gone anywhere except for World War I. And then in World War I, when you have this conflict that includes the Middle East, you have the imperial powers allied, Britain and France, with Russia, who had often been at odds, totally at odds, during most of the 19th century, quite often over the scramble for power, the scramble for territories in Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. You have this tremendous explosion. This wasn't the beginning of imperialism, but it was the real push, we might say, and much more occupation, particularly by France in North Africa. Well, what many people don't know is that in World War I, your subjects from these colonies or areas that you controlled, you had them fighting for you in Europe, not just in the Middle East. You had tens of thousands of Indians fighting there, etc. Many Muslims. The French had many people from North Africa, they had people from West Africa, Senegal, etc., all in the trenches. You see, you want them happy, you don't want them opposed to you. And they're very worried about Muslims, particularly responding to this caliphal call for holy war against the British, French, and Russians. So you want to get an Arab leader to revolt, and there had been a lot of contact with the Sharif Hussein of Mecca before. So finally you get this correspondence from the last 5 months of 1915, in which it appears that the British have promised independence in many areas, with only certain areas excluded, and that these include, from Hussein's point of view, he asked for it, Palestine as well as Syria, with Iraq having certain special qualifications because the British wanted to go in there to protect oil in the Persian Gulf. And Hussein had agreed with this. Well, technically Palestine was never included in the final version of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, but the British had no intention of living up to any of it because they'd already had the French promise for Syria, and so they were very vague about what might be excluded, subject to the interests of our ally France. Hussein agreed with this, and what was subject to the interests of our ally France was all of Syria, which then, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, and the Anglo-French Agreement was awarded as a sphere of influence or control, Syria and Lebanon, to France, and the British got control of Iraq. Palestine was to be neutral. Then Zionism comes along again because the leader of Zionism is in Britain. Chaim Weizmann has many close ties with British statesmen, and they want a declaration promising Palestine to them. And it's finally made in November of 1917 for wartime reasons. Weizmann has many close ties with British statesmen, and they want a declaration promising Palestine to them. And it's finally made in November of 1917 for wartime reasons, because by this time the Russians were about to collapse. You had one revolution in March, and now you're going to have a second one in November where the Bolsheviks come in. You're trying to forestall that, and if Russia goes out of the war, you're terrified, because Germany can then put all its troops against you and France on the Western Front. The United States isn't in there yet. And so, while there was a great deal of sympathy in the David Lloyd George government, and Arthur Balfour was the foreign minister for Zionism, wartime expediency played a major role, because the argument was, the way it was presented by Weizmann and people, was that if you promise Palestine to the Jewish people as a national home, then you've got so many Bolsheviks who are Jews, they'll be totally sympathetic and they'll stay in the war. Conversely, there are many Americans who want to see this, and this may influence Woodrow Wilson to actually commit troops, because Wilson had committed the United States to the war much earlier, but troops had not really come in, you see. And as a matter of fact, it had no influence, but troops did begin coming in January and February of 1918, and without them, Germany might have won the war in the major offensive that happened in March. Here you have the victorious powers coming together. And one of the deals after the war was that the victors could take all the colonial possessions of the losers. So there's this gradual parceling out between the British, French, and the Japanese particularly, of these lands. And how do you justify this? Because Woodrow Wilson really opposed this. He said his 14 points, of course, of January 1918, the wishes of the inhabitants of a country should be considered as the primary concern. If we're allowing European rulers to come in, if they're not going to be independent, then the will of the population must be considered. So it can't be colonies. And so you created the idea of mandates. And a mandate meant that anyone who took over a territory, new or otherwise, and say Palestine, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, which had never existed as countries before, are now divided up. And they become countries, and they become mandatories of France and Britain. And the way you get around the idea of colonial spoils and all that is to say the mandate obligates you to prepare the inhabitants of these countries for self-government at some time in the future. But then Palestine became a special case because the British violated the provisions of the Mandate for Palestine, because they put the Balfour Declaration into the Palestine Mandate, you say. What did this mean? It meant that for Palestine, the wishes of the inhabitants, 90% Arab, would not be listened to, and they would not be developed for independence. It would be Jews, once they came in through immigration, you see, they would be allowed to develop. And so it's really with the Palestinian Mandate and the violation of the mandatory provisions to give the Zionists the right to create a majority of Jews to create a Palestinian state that the real Palestinian Zionist conflict begins.
Jerusalem, cradle of faith to Muslim, Jew, and Christian alike. Jerusalem, the birthplace of modern terrorism.
After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut clean.
In scenes eerily reminiscent of New York 55 years later, the Jerusalem bomb was the beginning of terrorism as a media event, designed to capture the world's attention.
The latest casualty list included 65 killed, 47 injured.
The perpetrators, Zionist Jews, members of Menachem Begin's Irgun terrorist network.
Blow up the officers' club.
Begin, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel, described this tactic as turning Palestine into a glass house, where the entire world was looking in.
I think it was one of these acts of violence that, ahead of its time, in an era before CNN, before instantaneous news, was choreographed precisely to attract international attention.
We were a minority, but we were a minority with a clear ideology that we must have a Jewish state to rebuild the state which was existing many, many hundreds of years ago.
The bombing of the King David Hotel was perhaps one of the most significant terrorist incidents of the 20th century. For many decades, it actually held the infamous record of having killed the largest number of people.
In a fight for liberty, you have always those who are more, call them extreme, or more adamant, or call them staunch, and they want it immediately, not to wait for the Messiah.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Freeman Perspective. Well, let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws. This was Mayor Amschel Rothschild back in 1790. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astonishing piece of sleight of hand ever invented. Banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and they will, with a flick of the pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from them, and all great fortunes will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for then this would be a better and a happier world to live in. But if you want to continue to be slaves of the bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let the bankers continue to create money and control credit. Sir John Stamp, former governor of the Bank of England. Pleasure of having Galen Ross here with me. And Galen is owner-operator of Ross International Enterprises. And you were born in Big Lake, Texas, and has been a member of the the Army Security Agency, which is a branch of the National Security Agency, which is getting much airplay these days, and was trained in the field of cryptoanalysis. After completing his first manuscript, Who's Who of the Elite, he tried to get this published through standard firms and was rejected many times. And if you look at the list of people who own these firms, you'll understand why by the end of this show. So he has devoted his life to bringing out the real truth of the evil ones in this world who would like to make us all their slaves. Welcome, Galen.
It's a pleasure, Freeman, to be with you.
It is great to have you
Looking
here.
forward to the discussion. Yeah, I sent the book out to probably 18 publishing houses, and all I got was farm letters because they dare not publish what I write. And of course, I want to make it clear in the very beginning, I don't paint any one group with a very broad brush. there are good and bad in every race, gender, sex, the whole works. And so I want to make it clear that I'm not anti-Semitic. I have many Jewish friends. I have friends in all races and cultures. And so we need to make sure that we address the bad people and not paint the good ones with the same brush.
Exactly. Well, what we're looking at here is control, and it just so happens that this control tends to go back to these very same people who claim Judaism.
Yeah, and we probably ought to take it way back to the very beginning of Judaism, and let us say probably 80% of the Jews today are Jews who are not Jews. And the reason I say that, they are not seeds of Abraham, or they're not descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. But in fact, they are descendants of Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun, and that type. They originated in the southern region of Russia, from Mongolia to the northern boundaries of China to the Black Sea. And there was a number of tribes that roamed that region, and they were sheep herders and camel herders and tradesmen, and so they started settling down in this area called Khazaria. That term is no longer on the map. It's part of southern Russia now. But Khazaria was a region north of the Caucasus Mountains, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea and south of the Volga River. The capital was Idil, and it really got fairly well organized around 400 AD.
And Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky was head of the right-wing revisionist party, Likud is that today. They wanted to control Jordan as well, Transjordan at the time. Forget just the West Bank. But he said, look, ladies and gentlemen, he said in 1921, he said, I've never heard of any people welcoming the people who are going to conquer them and take them over and deprive them of their land. We're going to have to fight them. And his idea was that this would be an iron wall, that you had to impose your will on Arabs, the Palestinians, to show them that you are all powerful, and ultimately they will submit. So the Zionist attitude was that you were going to have to crush the Palestinians. Now the Palestinians really didn't have very much power. They couldn't get any money in from outside. The labor Zionists, the official Zionist movement, people don't know this, was not the most powerful movement in Palestine, even though it was the official representative to Britain of Zionism. Chaim Weizmann in London, Ben Gurion in Palestine. But the major investment in Palestine was by independent Jewish investors. The Americans, Judge Brandeis, Louis Brandeis leading them, broke away from Zionism, labor Zionism, because they didn't want socialism and didn't want to be controlled. So it was really private investment more than anything else, not the socialist labor Zionism, that got most of the land that you actually bought, which was, by 1948, still only 1/3 of the land. And Palestinians was still 2/3 of the population. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, you begin to have a situation, and everyone knows what Hitler's about. And when he comes in, you begin to get, of course, anti-Jewish laws, racist laws, forbidding marriage with Aryans and things like this. And then it gets worse. You're barred from employment. And even before you really get the major persecution that's going to come in the later 30s, although the camps, the concentration camps, were really built for political opponents, mainly Catholics and some Protestants, not for Jews. They were put in there later on after 1941. But you begin to get Jews looking at this and saying, where can we go? And the Nazis are trying to encourage them to go. And there's actually an arrangement made with Zionists in Palestine so that German Jews who want to go can go to Palestine and have the equivalent of their wealth, they're leaving their property behind, transferred so that they get the value of their possessions in Palestine, you see. And so suddenly, in 1933 to 1936-37, you almost triple the Jewish population of Palestine because of these events in Europe. And the wealth that comes over is very significant because this influx, and some of it's from anti-Semitism against Jews in Poland as well during the time, is able to build an infrastructure, an industrial infrastructure that you've never had before. You get a middle class, upper middle class people with money to invest. You get new industries, which are not going to affect the Palestinian Arabs. They're totally separate from it. And this is quite a different class of people than the penniless workers who were coming over in the 20s that the labor Zionists were bringing over. So it transforms things. And with many other issues that are going on, it ultimately leads to an Arab revolt that is going to happen from 1936 and will not be fully crushed until 1939. And this is an Arab revolt. In part it is despair against what is seen suddenly. You know, the Jewish presence hasn't been that much before, but now suddenly you're getting a very large Jewish presence. So you seem to be losing ground in this way. You become aware, some of you, that your leadership may have been, some of it, selling land to Zionists. You have increasing expulsion from lands that are bought, because the idea of Jewish labor meant also that this was inalienable Jewish land. And that meant that once Jews bought land, it could never be sold to a non-Jew. And Arabs living on the land would be thrown off. And so while the percentage is not that large, it is, you know, several thousand people who are going into shanty towns around the cities, Haifa, Jaffa, etc., in the 30s. And so there's a displaced class of people here as well. And there's growing resentment as what is seen as the inability of the Palestinian leadership to oppose this in any form whatsoever. And so you ultimately get this revolt that is sparked actually by, it's interesting, this man, Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam. There's a Qassam brigade in Hamas today. A Muslim preacher who had been ministering to these displaced workers and saying around in the shanty towns and saying that Islam is the only way you'll have any pride because you're being, you know, displaced, you have no property, you're homeless, etc., etc. And so the revolt explodes, dies down for a bit, and the British come in and propose a partition of Palestine in the Peel Commission report of 1937. And it's in reaction to that that you get the real explosion of the Arab revolt from later 1937 with the major casualties down to early 1939. And at one point, the Palestinian rebels control most of Palestine, in the hinterland, not the cities. And the British are unable to do very much because, particularly in 38, because of tensions in Europe, Hitler, Czechoslovakia, etc. Now, the Jewish state was quite small, and it followed more or less the land holdings in the northwest, essentially, and northern parts of Palestine. It was only about 25% of Palestine. But it had the wealthiest land. And it also had an equal population of Arabs who would have to leave. You'd have forcible transfer. Presumably they'd be reimbursed, but they had been there first, and they had developed a citrus industry there long before the Zionists came in. So there was that sense of injustice. Then, although the Arabs got more land, there was also this sense that there was no Palestinian state, because the way the British proposed it, this is a little complicated, the state was to include Transjordan, you see, which had been created in 1921 and given to one of the sons of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the Emir Abdullah. Abdullah had been very interested in aligning himself with Zionists and moderate Palestinians to get Jewish investment in Transjordan, because economically it was a basket case. And so he was very close to the British. So when the Peel Commission report comes in, the Palestinian Arab area is going to be part of Transjordan with Abdullah, who's an Arab from the Hijaz, the Red Sea part of Arabia, as ruler. It's not going to be a Palestinian state, whereas the Zionists, the Jews, are going to get a Jewish state, you say. So the Arabs are opposed to this from the beginning, in part because they're simply not going to rule, you see, and also because they see that the land they're getting, although it's much more, is of much less value. The Zionists were upset because they wanted more land, you see, because after all, let's face it, Hitler's aims are quite clear at this point. And on the one hand, the Zionist leadership wants to get any state so that they can control it and take in as many people as they can. You see. But the majority of Zionists initially opposed this, and finally Ben Gurion persuaded them, look, go along with this and we'll see if we can get more land out of this. Well, this never came to fruition simply because the British Foreign Office said, we don't want an independent state of anyone in Palestine because World War II is coming. There's going to be war in the Mediterranean and Europe. And if we have independent leaders there, we won't be able to act. So they put the kibosh on the whole deal. But one thing that the Zionist leadership did assure its following of at the time was, look, we can accept the state in a small area now, and we'll simply expand later on. And they actually did this in 1948. The Zionists were never committed to the boundaries of the partition with the Palestinian area. They never were. They assumed that at some point they might be able to take more land and expand. And so the Arabs in part rebelled against that as well as against their own leaders. And it turned into a bloodbath in which then Palestinians were turning against each other. And the British were aligned with the Zionists in terms of crushing it. And once you thought you had peace in Europe after the Munich agreements, when Chamberlain came back in October 38, we have peace for our time, then the British were able to send a lot of troops and armored cars over to Palestine and crush the Arab revolt. Now, ironically, as soon as they did that, they then turned around in a very cynical deal and undermined their commitment to the Zionists. In a 1939 white paper that came out in May, but they've been planning this for a while. Because here they are looking at, ensuing war, which is coming ever closer. And they're saying, well, the Arab countries surrounding Palestine are getting increasingly upset at what's going on in Palestine. And it's safe to say that up to that time, of the Arab revolt in 1936, you had not had any major concern. You had delegations from Arab states, but keep in mind they're all occupied by Europeans. The French were in Syria and Lebanon. Iraq had become independent in 1932, but with a deal for British air bases and things. But nonetheless, it was much more independent. Egypt was under the control of the British. So, but once you had this Arab revolt, then Islamic elements in Egypt, particularly, begin to call attention to what's going on. This is the Muslim Brotherhood that had been founded in 1929 by Hassan al-Banna. And they defined this as Islamic land, Muslim land. And they shamed the government into calling conferences, you see, to become more concerned. And so it's only from that time that you begin to get people, Arabs in other areas, really committed and starting to donate, although there's not much you can do. So you have a situation then where, how are we going to keep these people quiet? Because these Arab delegations are getting really angry because their populations are getting angry. We've got to promise them something. So in the white paper of 1939, you actually say that the Balfour Declaration was never intended to create a Jewish state against the will of the Palestinian Arabs. Well, that's nonsense. It was. They were never consulted. But you're now saying this. And as a result, you're saying that you are going to stop Jewish immigration. It's going to be very limited, 5,000 a year for 5 years. 15,000 a year for 5 years, up to 75,000. You're stopping land sales, because this is the other major friction, immigration and land sales. And in 10 years, this is said arbitrarily, you will negotiate with the Arabs and the Zionists about what type of state. And if they can't agree, then you will, the British, unilaterally impose a solution. Now, what that would mean was a state in Palestine that was 2/3 Arab and 1/3 Jewish. See what I mean? No Israel, no Jewish state in Palestine. So you were doing this not out of sympathy for the Palestinian Arabs. You could care less about them. You just crushed them. You killed an awful lot of them. You were worried about your Arab rulers and these states around and uprisings that might divert attention and troops from what you were going to do elsewhere. Well, the Zionists were infuriated, but they had no choice, you see. They had to go along with this, and Ben-Gurion said, well, fight the white paper as if there's no war. Well, we'll fight the war as if there's no white paper. Initially, we'll cooperate, and then we'll fight the white paper as if there's no war. We'll fight the war first, forget the white paper, then we'll fight the British and the white paper. And so once the threat towards Egypt and the Suez Canal receded with the Battle of El Alamein late in 1942, and the British began pushing the Germans, who'd come in, of course, Rommel and the Africa Corps, back to Tunisia. From 1943 on, Zionists in Palestine, with allies in the British Army and Zionists in Egypt, began stealing arms from the British to prepare for war against the British after the war was over. And they also had many people who fought with the British Army in Europe. But these people retained their ties to their superiors in the Haganah, the Jewish defense groups, and they were prepared then to align and to use their training against the British after the war, if this was deemed necessary.
Still lying under the shadow of terrorist attacks, many areas of Palestine are...
By the end of World War II, the British, who had been made responsible for looking after Palestine by the old League of Nations 27 years earlier, found it to be a serious headache. They were caught in the middle of the Arabs and the Jews, both of whom wanted the country for their own, were unwilling to peacefully coexist, and were agreed on only one thing: their hatred of the British, whom they both saw as foreign occupiers. The British military and administrative headquarters was here, in the south wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The luxury hotel itself still functioned with guests, restaurants, bars, and Sudanese waiters.
Jerusalem at that time, it was a fortress. And I walk through the town and put in my mind every place and think about how can we attack this place. If we succeed, it's very important the whole world will see that we can fight even the British.
Begin and Ellis decided on a daring plan. They would strike at the very heart of British rule, the King David Hotel itself. If they succeeded here, the whole world would take notice. The terrorist's bomb was hidden in 7 milk churns and delivered in a hijacked pickup truck to the hotel's basement kitchen.
We jumped out, and everyone took up their positions. I took the churn and started to run. I was thinking, how do I get to the place where I have to put the churn down? That's how I started. Anyway, there were lots of people around in the corridor. We tried to move them out of the way. Here, there, to the side. But there were some who resisted, but we threatened them with our weapons. I wasn't dressed as a civilian or a soldier. I was dressed like an Arab, with a jalaba and a kafir, with that ring on your head. You know, like, what's he called? The leader of the Arabs. You know, Arafat. There were 7 churns, weighing 350 kilos in all. I ran until I reached the place where I had to put it down, with the churn on my shoulder. Carried on, until I got to the place where the British people were. I saw a pillar that used to be here, and I put the churn down and ran away immediately. I waited in my position until all the churns were together, and then the time would come for the explosion. All the churns together were like one whole man, a complete bomb.
The bomb went off at 12:37 and was devastating. But of the 91 dead, only 28 were British. 17 Jews died alongside 41 Arabs. Of all these, 54 were innocent civilians, unconnected to the British authorities in any way.
Once more, the civilized world has received a rude shock at the hands of fanatics whose wanton act is contrary to the dictates of all creeds alike, and imperils the best interests of the cause that it strives to promote.
The Irgun denied that they aimed at civilian targets, but one man at least had a different opinion. In 1948, the British Chief Secretary in Palestine, Sir Henry Gurney, wrote in his diary of how one Irgun attack was indiscriminately aimed at civilian targets, and was designed to create panic among the population.
16 persons.
3 years later, Gurney himself was to be assassinated, as liberation movements all over the world took note of the flame that had been ignited in Palestine. By 1948, the British and the world community had lost their appetite for the fight against the Jewish terrorists, and the British abandoned Palestine, leaving Arab and Jew to fight it out amongst themselves. But elsewhere in their restless colonies, others had watched and learnt from the success of the Zionist terrorists.
The reason I say that the Chazarian Jews are Jews who are not Jews is because about 741 AD, and some say it could be 861, the king of the Chazars, or Kagan Bulan was his name, decided that his tribesmen needed a religion. Most of them were idolaters or atheists, and so he felt like he needed to raise the level of his tribe. So he called in the three major religions at the time, Christianity, Mohammedanism, and Judaism, and had the leaders make a pitch on the advantages of their religion. And after it was all over, he selected Judaism, and probably for the reason that if he selected Christianity or Mohammedanism, he might then become subservient to the religious leaders of those two groups. And so he selected Judaism, informed his tribes that from there on they're to worship Judaism and either convert to Judaism or leave the region. And so they ran the idolaters out of the region. The men were circumcised, and from then on they worshiped Judaism. So these are Jews who are not Jews only because they just adopted the religion of Judaism.
And you begin then to have this whole period from 1945 to 48 in which the United States plays an increasingly important role. This had begun in 1942 in the Biltmore program. There was a meeting at the Biltmore Hotel in May of 42 where the Zionists met to try and mobilize support among American Zionists, because most American Jews were not committed Zionists. And you wanted to arouse them also to the horrors of what was going on and try to push the Roosevelt administration to do something also about the atrocities in Europe and maybe do something about the camps. This did not happen. But this also led to a major split within Zionism, because Chaim Weizmann was still in England, and he wanted to negotiate vis-a-vis the British. Ben-Gurion was saying, he was based in Palestine, but he'd come to this meeting in New York, forget the British. It's facts on the ground, and we're going to mobilize opinion in the United States against the British if necessary in order to do this. And the history is very complicated from 1945 to 48, but essentially the British are so weakened by World War II. People don't realize this, that they wound up much worse off, finally, than the French, the Italians, and the Germans, because we gave those people a Marshall Plan to develop their economies to stop the appeal of communism. You see what I mean? And we rebuilt Japan for anti-communist reasons. But the British economy remained terribly weak well into the 1960s. And in the winter of 46, 47, gas, you couldn't buy gas for cars for 6 months. And the winter was so bad that people froze in their homes because there was not enough coal. And the British were still trying to maintain their empire. But you also were so frustrated with Zionist resistance and terrorist attacks against the British, and the United States, Truman, for sometimes domestic political reasons, was, making statements favorable to Zionism, infuriating the British. Well, as a result of all of this, in William Roger Lewis's term, the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin of Great Britain, hurled Palestine into the United Nations. Technically, they still had the mandate, and they said they will withdraw in 48, but they were no longer responsible for it. The United Nations sent a committee to evaluate this in the summer of 47, and they recommended partition. And the Zionists eagerly accepted this, and the Palestinian Arabs didn't, because they were still 2/3 of the population, and they felt this was unjust. Now, you can argue all you want about whether they should have, all their fault, and certainly the Israelis have said ever since that the Palestinians never lost an opportunity to never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But a lot of powers, including Israel, had quite to make quite sure at times that the Palestinians would miss that opportunity. You know, the conditions would be such that they would feel they had no choice but to reject something. But nonetheless, this partition, which was approved in the UN after Thanksgiving in 1947, officially recognized two states, Palestine and Israel, to be declared, within 6 months.
By the way, most of probably at least 80% of the Jews of the world are Chazarian Jews.
Really?
And probably between 80 and 90% of the inhabitants of Israel are Chazarian Jews, because most of them are immigrants from Russia, and just about all of the immigrants from Russia were Chazarian Jews. So if one of the Israeli Jews were to say, we want our homeland, then maybe their homeland is the steppes of Russia rather than Israel.
Well, these guys are prone to pitting groups together. Now, they, like we had said, stand apart on their own, but then they'll fund both sides of the war and then reap all the benefits of everything.
Yeah, in fact, they caused, since about 1765, they've caused every war. They financed both sides of every war. And they financed the reconstruction of the nations destroyed in the wars. So this is a great source of income for them.
Yes.
So let me just define the term Semite.
Okay.
A Semite is a group of Arabic and Jewish Semitic-speaking people of the Near East and North Africa, including Amharic, Arabic, Aramaic, Akkadian, Hebrew, Maltese, Syriac, and Tigrian tribes. So the term Semitic is both Arabs and Jews. And so
we get easily caught up in terms.
Yeah, so you need to know the term if you're going to use it, know what you're talking about.
Right.
And that may be part of the plan too.
Yeah. I wonder that a lot of the time.
Nothing of significance happened anywhere in the world that is not carefully planned by the elite. I just encourage everybody, don't believe what we say, but to go out and research it yourself and see if you can prove we're wrong. You can't, but you need to try to do that. And if you can't prove us wrong, then you need to tell everybody that listen to you, so that you can also help in this effort to tell the truth to the entire world.
Realize
You could try to play, but you're never gonna beat me. Look the other way, what I'm doing ain't easy. Bloody hands stained from the people who deceive me. Muddy hands break through the chains, go free me. Looking for change, looking for pain, pulling a mob, pushing a train. I'll never stop, stick to a lane, pick up the pieces and go rearrange. I'll be the best above all the rest, put me to the test and expect nothing less, your check as I'm chess, what's happening next, yeah. He got the venom, a tangible weapon, no coming in second. This life is a lesson, he got a new engine from pain, it's a blessing. New focus, no guessing, just bold and obsession, all in his possession. You got their attention, I'll leave an impression and take a redemption. Just kill, no discretion, your mind is a weapon. 11-11, it's time for progression, You could try to play, but you're never gonna beat me. Look the other way, what I'm doing ain't easy. Bloody hands stained from the people who deceive me. Muddy hands break through the chains, go free me. People like sheep move feet, hurt it easy. You don't wanna be fast asleep when they scheming. Better stand tall, ready for a fight, believe me. When they try the chains, you can say no, free me. So he's been looking for somebody who could save him, instead of searching inside for what they gave him. A strong will, strong mind causes mayhem. We could change the world, change times, rearrange them. Staying on pace, running the race. Life is a chase, I don't want a place, I wanna be first. Work till it hurts, dehydrated thirst till I'm in a hearse. High ambitions in the right mind can take you so far. It's like you lived a few lifetimes. Take off from a break off from the weak minds. They can stay soft. You can change lives. You create thoughts. Never waste time. You got one shot. You got one life. Better pop off. What do you like? Make a dream job. No 9 try to play, but you're never gonna beat me. Look the other way, what I'm doing ain't easy. Bloody hands stained from the people who deceive me. Muddy hands break through the chains, go free me. People like sheep move feet, hurt it easy. You don't wanna be fast asleep when they scheming. Better stand tall, ready for a fight, believe me. When they drag the chains, you can say no, free me.